In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to create an application that connects to a database and displays the information somehow in the application. I'd highly encourage you to take a look at the lesson text for lesson 17 before you get started watching this video. It's going to give you some background information on the purpose of databases, how to connect to a database, and the objects that we'll use in this video in order to enable that functionality. So I'm assuming that you've already looked over the lesson text before watching this. So, to get started, you'll notice that I have a project called Lesson 17. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is work with the Server Explorer over here to the left-hand side. I'm actually going to pin this down for the moment and rearrange the window sizes just for a moment. A data connection is sort of like a shortcut that you can use across all the projects that you'll create within your instance of Visual Studio on your local computer. So in the future, if you need to create a reference to a database, such as the Northwind database, which is what we're going to use right now, then you don't have to go through this step every time. You can merely use some of the preset settings for the connection of the database and use that across all of your applications. So I'm going to select Add Connection from the pop-up menu. I could also just select this little plus icon over a database. The first thing I need to do is go to the Provider tab and select the correct provider for the database that I'm trying to use. And in this case, I want to use an Access database, so I need to use the Microsoft Jet 4.0 OLE DB provider. And then I'll select the Next button. Now it's going to allow me to select or enter a database name. I'm going to click the ellipsis, and I'm going to find that database on my hard drive. Now I just copied the file that I need to the to the root directory, fpnwind.mdb, and this is included with the source code in a zip file. So if you need to use this lesson, you can merely open up that zip file, unzip it to a common location like your C:/ directory of your hard drive, and then you'll have it available like I do right here. Then I'm going to click the Open on that dialog. Now I don't need to enter any of this sort of information. There's no login and password, so all I need to do, though, is test the connection and make sure that it works, and it seems to work just fine. So then I'm going to click the OK button. Now it's going to ask me, or sometimes it'll ask me, if I want to save the password, even if I haven't entered a password. And you can go ahead and click Do Not Save a Password because we're not dealing with, well, for two reasons. First of all, Access databases, in most of the time, don't have a password associated with them, but also from a security perspective, you don't want to leave your connection strings with their username and password in them. You may want to take a more secure approach by encoding that somehow, and there are videos on LearnVisualStudio.net that talk more about securing your connections to databases, so we'll not talk about that just right now. But at any rate, now I have a shortcut to that database, and I can actually, in some versions of VisualStudio.net, navigate through and see all the tables and even look at the fields that are within those tables, and I can open up and look at the data in a given table. Now again, your version of VisualStudio.net may not allow you to do this, so you may not have that functionality. But at any rate, my objective in this application that I'm writing is to interface with this database and take all the customers or company name field, I believe is what we want to do, this company name field, and display them in a big text box. So let's go ahead and draw the controls on the screen that we'll need. And I think I want to name this TXT result. And let's change the text property, just blank that out. And then there's also a property called multi-line that I'm going to switch to true. And then I'm going to make this about the size of the window. And then the next thing I want to do is modify this and change this to start, and we'll call this BTN start. Okay. Now the purpose of this example is to show you how to connect to a database and then how to retrieve values from the database. So the first little hint that I'll give you is that you can easily create a connection to a database by going to your Server Explorer and then dragging and dropping that data connection on to the designer surface of your form. Now here's where you get the little dialog box that pops up. It'll ask you if you want to save the password, and in this case we're just going to say don't include password. Now you'll notice that there's a new area that is viewable on my designer surface, and that is what's called the designer tray. And here are objects that are referenced within your application, however they don't have a visual presence to them. There's no way to represent a connection as a visual item. It's something that we will utilize within the application, but it doesn't in and of itself have any visual quality. So they put it here in this little designer tray. And we can still modify the properties of this item as we have it selected here in the designer tray. What we're going to do though for right now is just leave it alone, because when we drag and drop from our Server Explorer and drop it onto our design surface, it will already fill in all the properties that we need for it to have. You'll have the data source, the provider, and there'll be a connection string. You can see as I hover my mouse cursor over it, it pops open. And so all this is done for us automatically. We don't have to type anything else in. So we're just going to leave it the way that it is right now. Now from the lesson text, you recall that the connection object merely opens up a channel to begin speaking with the database. That's the only job of the connection object. So when it comes to actually talking to the database to request information out of the database, this is not the object that we need to use. Instead, we'll use a command object. So here we're going to go to our toolbox, and I'm going to go to the data section of the toolbox, and I'll drag and drop an OLE-DB command onto the designer surface, and you'll notice that it too winds up in our designer tray. You'll recall from the lesson text that the only job that the command object has is to request information from the database. It'll use the open channel that was created by the connection to request records from the database according to what you specify in the properties of that command. So that's what we'll do right now, is set some properties for the command. The first thing that we need to do is to specify which connection that we'll use for this command. Now there could be multiple connections associated with this form. We've only got one right now on our form, so it'll be fairly easy to find it. I'm going to use the drop down arrow, and then I'm going to click this little plus sign to expand out all of the existing connections in order to find the one that I need. In this case I want OLE-DB connection 1, which is the only one we have on our form right now. Then the next thing I need to do is to set the command text. The command text is the actual instruction that we want to send to the database of which tables and fields and rows that we want from that database to be returned back to our application. So whenever I highlight that property, notice that a little ellipsis window appears. I'm going to click the ellipsis and the Query Builder pops open. Now the first thing that the Query Builder will ask us to do is to select the tables that we want to work with from our data source. So here we see a list of all of the tables that are inside of the Northwind database. Now for our purposes, we just want to display all of the company names, I believe, from the customer table. So I'm going to select the customer table and click Add. And notice in the background behind this Add Table dialog that a little chart that actually represents the table, the customer table, it appears in our little Query Builder workspace. So we could select other tables or views if we had any from our, the Northwind database, but that's the only one we need to work with for our purposes. So I'm going to click the Close button. Let's move this over a little bit. As you can see, the Query Builder is split up into 4 different panes. This first pane is referred to as the diagram pane. This next area is referred to as the grid pane. This is referred to as the SQL pane, and finally this area is referred to as the results pane. So basically what we can do here is specify the columns that we want and the rows that we want to be returned to our application. For example, I could just click this all columns icon, or this little checkbox here, and notice when I do that, the little star appears in the column and the table and the output are all input on one row, and we also see that some SQL code has been written as well. These are three different ways of representing the same query. Select all the customers from the customer table. That's essentially what we're saying here and saying here as well. So if some of these panes get in the way, that's not quite the way that you want to see them represented, you can close panes by right-clicking in any area and then select Show Panes, and we could, for example, get rid of the grid view, and now we just have 3 panes. I'm going to go ahead and show the grid view. Now if we want to just pick specific columns and not the little asterisk, which means all columns, I could unclick all columns and then select just the columns that we need. And notice when I do that, first of all, the grid view allows us to see each of our selections one row at a time. And then the SQL view, which will actually get sent to our database, shows us the columns in a more textual way. This is the actual command that will get sent to our database. So this is the view I prefer to work with because I know SQL. However, if you're new to working with databases, you might want to just kind of work with either the design or the grid view. Now we would be able to sort the rows that come back by a given column, so we could get back all the rows from the customer's database. The columns we would get are the address, city, company name, and contact name, and it could sort the values based on the city. Or we could say where the city equals, Burbank or something like that. So there's other things that we can do. I don't want to get too far into this right now because this is a little bit more advanced from the point where you're at right now in learning about how to work with databases. Just be forewarned that there's actually a lot that we can do with the Query Builder, and we're not going to touch on too much of its functionality at this time. But after we've written a query or designed a query, what we can do then is right-click in any of the white areas and select Run. And when we do, the results pane will show us all the records that we'll retrieve back from the database. So these are the records that we could expect to see in our application. I'm going to go ahead and allow the Query Builder to just return these values back to us right now, and I'm going to click the OK button. And so we've configured our command. And now what we need to do in order to get all of the names of the companies from our command and put them and display them onto our form, we're going to need to write some code. So I'm going to double click the Start button in order to get to the code view. I'm going to go ahead and move some things around since I'll be working in the code view now. And what I'm going to do is create another object called a data reader. Now we'll create this object in code as opposed to creating it from a more drag and drop method like we've done for the connection and the command. However, we could have created the connection and the command in code right here in this particular method that I'm working in right now. It's just a preference. We were able to do things in a very automated kind of way by dragging and dropping or using visual designers, where we might have to write lines and lines and lines of code in order to do that right here in the code view. But they would both work out to do the exact same thing if we wanted to either write code or use the more visual designer. So the first thing I need to do is create an instance of a data reader. So I'm going to go ahead and type out the whole namespace. Now we said that the connection object opens up a channel to the database. the command object knows how to request information from the database, there's yet a third object that we're going to use in order to retrieve values back from the database. So all these are separate operations as far as ADO.NET is concerned. And there's several different ways to do this, but we've chosen a data reader to get started with. And a data reader is a way of connecting to the database and grabbing all the records from the database, and it's a very fast way of connecting and grabbing information down. So this data reader will actually give us, I guess you could say, a bookmark or a pointer to the current record that we're on. We're able to retrieve that record, information about that record, and then move on to the next record in the results set that's returned from our request that was codified in our command object. Okay? So there's a relationship between all these objects, but yet they're still different and they have a very distinct purpose within ADO.NET. So the first thing that I need to do, I'm going to do this. Ole db command1 dot execute reader. The command object has several different execute statements, but this is the correct execute statement, the execute reader method, for grabbing information from the database and retrieving it and giving that, in this case, a kind of a bookmark or a pointer to our data reader. So now that we have a reference into the database of the result set that's brought back from our command, we'll need to loop through each item within our result set. Now that line of code, the while statement, is very analogous to what we learned about in the previous lesson when we looked at how the stream reader works, where each time we call the read method, it will grab one row of data, and the next time we call the read method, it'll call the next row of data, and so on until read returns false to us. So this is the equivalent of saying while read equals true. But recall, shorthand syntax, we don't need to put the equal true. All we need to do is just dr.read, and this will work just fine. So while we can still read from our data reader, then let's do this. Let's take our results.text plus equals dr, so our data reader, and think of a data reader kind of like an array. We can look at a single element within that data reader, or a single column within the result sets that are brought back in a data reader. So we're going to give it the column name, company name. Okay, now if you recall from the previous lesson as well, what did we need to do once we were finished reading and writing from the file? We needed to close it. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to go dr.close, and then we'll also do this, ole db connection1.close. I just realized a small mistake that I made. I just got rid of the S on the end of results, so it should be txt result.text. So let's save that, and let's try to run our application, and it will not work. We'll get an exception, and the exception says execute reader requires an open and available connection. The connection's current state is closed. So this is a pretty simple problem to correct. I did this on purpose so that you could see that this is a very important thing that you can't forget, and that is to actually open the connection. This is not done implicitly. You have to explicitly open the connection, and you must keep the connection open as long as you are working with the data reader. Once you're finished with the data reader, then you can close the connection. The data reader depends on an open connection to the database to continue to retrieve the next row of results from the database. So now, let's go ahead and run our application, and this time, hopefully, it'll work. Great. Now, it returns back a ton of information to us, and if we were to double check this, these are indeed all the company names that are from the company table from our Northwind database. So in closing, let's briefly review the steps that we took in order to connect to the database and retrieve information out. First of all, we need to create a connection, and we did that by dragging and dropping a connection from our Server Explorer. And then we created an OLADB command and set its properties, such as the database connection and, most importantly, the command text, by clicking on the ellipsis and opening up the Query Builder dialog, where we actually wrote our query using the visual tools that were available to us. And then in our source code view, we created a variable called dr, and this was our bucket to read the data so that it's a type OLADB data reader, and we opened a connection to our database. Then we executed the execute reader command of the command object, and the result that we got back was placed into our dr object, our data reader, and then we simply looped through our data reader, and as long as there was records in there, we appended those records, or specifically the company name column of each record, to the txt result text box, and then in the end we closed our data reader and closed our connection. So that wraps up this video for Lesson 17. Don't forget to do the exercise for Lesson 17 so you can get some hands-on exercise with accessing data in a database. And let me also say that ADO.NET is huge, and that we're only really touching on the tip of the iceberg here. If you don't know anything about databases, I'd really recommend that you study up on how to use databases in Microsoft Access. Once you get that under your belt, then you can probably move on to learn more about SQL Server, which is what a lot of companies use in order to manage the data for their company. Thank you.